Hey you guys, it is day 3 of our Resurrection Eggs Easter Devotional. And today it's all about food, which is great because I love food. We're either talking about food or drink. It has to do with what we call the Last Supper. And this was actually the Passover meal. This was the whole reason that Jesus and his crew were even in Jerusalem. During the Passover meal, Jesus introduced us to what we as Christians, as followers of Christ, we call communion. And this meal, which we often take after our church services, it's made up of some kind of bread-like item and juice. I like bread and I like juice, so let's do it. So if we look in these resurrection eggs from 8 years ago, oyster cracker, and I don't know if you want to eat an oyster cracker from 8 years ago. And the one that we made 4 years ago, and we also find an oyster cracker. I don't know if you want to eat one from 4 years ago. When we look in the fancy store-bought one, we find a wine glass, okay? So they were here, and they were celebrating, and they were eating the Passover meal. And there are lots of parts to the Passover meal. But the main reason that it's celebrated, that it's still celebrated to this day, all about the 10 plagues on Egypt, when Pharaoh wouldn't let God's people go. A plague is a large problem which causes chaos and trouble for many people. And Moses was chosen by God to lead his people, to lead God's people out of Egypt. Also, the Hebrews were God's people. The only way that they could do that was to free them from being the Egyptian slaves. God tried and tried through Moses, and he was trying to help the people of Egypt realize that they needed to free the Hebrews from being slaves. But Pharaoh would not listen. So all the Hebrews that were living in Egypt at the time were instructed by God through Moses to spread lamb's blood around their door frame. We know a lamb is a small, peaceful animal which is also used as food. So when these families killed their lambs for dinner, they were instructed to take some of that blood and brush it around their door frame. And then that plague, that final plague, that 10th plague, it would pass over the houses of the Hebrews. And that's why this holiday is called Passover. Okay, so just like the Hebrews were slaves to Egyptians, we today, followers of Jesus who live today, we are slaves to sin, to doing what we want to do instead of listening to what God wants us to do. We just get to this point where we just want to do what we want to do. We just get caught up in that and we can't let that go. So it's like being a slave to that. But Jesus came, and just like that peaceful, innocent lamb whose blood was brushed around the door frame, Jesus' blood was spilled when he died on the cross. And the reason he allowed that to happen was so we could be freed from this slavery, just like the Hebrews. So we can be saved from this slavery of our sin and living a life that's not following God, so that we could live life for God instead of living life for the people and the things that are around us. Jesus taught us during that Last Supper was how to take communion. He said, eat this bread and drink this wine, which we use bread or crackers. Adults can use actual wine, but in church we use juice. The bread represents Jesus's body. We remember his body as we eat that bread and remember that his body was crucified. And that juice, it represents Jesus's blood. It's for us to remember that it was poured out to save us, to bring us closer to God. So that blood is not sad. It actually means that we are saved to God, to be closer to him. Have you guys ever seen anyone take communion? They eat the bread and they drink the juice. They do this to remember Jesus and what he did for us. His body was broken and his blood was spilled so that we can live forever with God after our time on this earth is done. You can totally ask your parents more about this. And Sunday at online church, you guys should totally take communion together at the end. That would be so awesome for your family to do that together. Tell them you want to do that. I love you guys. And now it's time for some real eggs.